Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Podbean podcast and YouTube videos on my channel, gaudium@spez.com 22. I haven't done a podcast in over a week now because of Holy Week. So, a blessed Easter to everybody, Easter season to everybody out there. I'm a little bit rusty since I haven't done a podcast now in like 8 days. So, geez, that's a long time for me. But I'm back in the saddle, excited today. Uh, Going to be interviewing today my guest today, the guest of honor, Dr. Paul Seaton. And Dr. Paul Seaton is the Richard and Barbara Fisher Professor of Philosophy at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore. And he's been there, according to what I saw on the interwebs, and the interwebs are always right. He's been there since 2005. He's also, as I did, he got his PhD at Fordham University. What year did you get? Did you finish your doctorate at Fordham?
2004, and you see the connection.
2004, and then you started at St. Mary's 2005. I got my doctorate in 1994, and I assume you studied under the famous Father Katersky at Fordham.
Well, he's in theology, and I was in political science, political philosophy. But of course, in the Catholic community, I interacted with him regularly. But also, I knew Cardinal Dulles. Uh, I started my academic career at Catholic U, and I got to know Avery Dulles
Right.
personally well. And then when I moved to Fordham, he had just come back to Fordham for his long years of retirement. So it was good to reconnect with him as well.
Yes, he was there. He came there right when I was leaving Fordham, so I never had any classes with him. But I thought Father Katersky was a philosopher. I guess I was wrong about that. I thought he was in the philosophy department.
No, you're right. I was in political science though, so we were
Oh
not
yeah,
in the
yeah.
same
Okay,
department.
so you
Yeah.
weren't in philosophy. So that what's leading this up to is that you're interested in political thought. So would it be accurate to describe you as a political philosopher or a political scientist with philosophical leanings, or simply an intellectual about town doing political thinking?
Well, I like Thoreau. I've traveled much in Concord, so it depends on where you put. Yeah, no, I'm a political philosopher who does pay attention to political science because sometimes facts are important.
Sometimes, yeah, once in a while, facts are important. Well, anyway, welcome, Dr. Seaton, to the show. Dr. Seaton is also an expert in the thought of French thinkers, especially some French political and Catholic thinkers, which is what drew my interest. I mean, this whole contact with you kind of started because I was interviewing. Well, we've known each other as on social media for a while, but it kind of intensified a bit when I interviewed Daniel Mahoney, a mutual friend of ours. And turns out, yeah, that there's a lot of mutual intellectual interest there. I discovered that you are a prolific translator of French thinkers, and the two in particular that I want to look at today, and I want to introduce my viewers to. The first one is a French uh, political thinker named Pierre Manent, who's been a prolific writer for many, many, many years. But you've translated, and there's a collection of essays, and you've got a wonderful introduction in a book called "The Religion of Humanity: The Illusion of Our Times." The Religion of Humanity, the Illusion of Our Times, edited and translated by Paul Seaton. But then the other thinker that we're going to focus on today is someone whose writings I have been reading for a very long time, and I just love the guy, Remi Brague. And for my viewers, he's been around for quite a long time. Remi Brague must be getting on in years now, I would imagine, because he's been writing for as long as I can remember. But the book in question that I want to look at today, I got this about 4 months ago now. The Kingdom of Man: Genesis and Failure of the Modern Project, translated by none other than my guest today, Paul Seaton. You are a prolific translator, sir, but I would highly recommend to all my viewers that they also get this book, The Kingdom of Man: Genesis and Failure of the Modern Project. What both of these books have in common, I haven't completely finished the Remi Brague book, but I did finish the collection of essays, The Illusion of Our Times, The Religion of Humanity by Pierre Manent. And the common denominator, all right, is that kind of the religion of the French sociologist Auguste Comte, the religion of humanity, and this is Daniel Mahoney's kind of theme too, has become, in a sense, the religion of our time, and is a it is not benign. It is a kind of rival religion to the Christian faith. So let's start with Pierre Manent. First off, welcome to the show, and you can dive into the topic of Pierre Manent from any angle that you choose. But let's begin with him. And what do you think is most significant about him with regard to this question of the religion of humanity?
Pierre, he's a political philosopher. I think he's the single best political philosopher in at least the world, in the West today. He's a political philosopher, and he's a Catholic, actually a Catholic convert. So he leads with reason, but faith is always there. But he looks at Catholicism and the church from the point of view of a political philosopher. And what I mean by that is he looks at it as an authoritative community among the authoritative communities of humanity. So he'll look at China, he'll look at France, he'll look at the EU, he'll look at Russia, and then he'll look at the Catholic Church. He'll also look at the Ummah, and he's very interested in, the way he likes to say it is, Islam is on the march. And he says,
Yeah.
if you don't see that, you're not looking at the world as it is. Okay, so he's a political philosopher, and I used to say he's a discreet Catholic, but the past handful or more of years, he's more overtly Catholic. And his most recent book, it came out in 2022, is on Pascal. Now, I know you're going to say I like Pascal because you also you like Peggy, you like Pascal, and you don't like Descartes. Nobody likes Descartes anymore.
But I do kind of like Descartes. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, for yeah, they're if you want a world transforming project, Descartes is a leading
Yeah.
candidate along with any other modern philosophers. So he's a political philosopher. He's a increasingly explicit Catholic, but again, he doesn't look at it culturally. He looks at it through the prism of what kind of community is it and what impact does it have on the geopolitics or the European politics that I observe today.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll pause and let you.
Well, it's just I remember the very first thing that I read by him years ago, now maybe 20 years ago, was his small little book, Intellectual History of Liberalism.
Yeah.
And I thought, I mean, it was a very insightful book. I was very struck by many of the deep insights. And once again, that's a book I would recommend to my viewers to read, Intellectual History of Liberalism, Pierre Manent. But at the end of the book, I thought, well, he has a relatively positive view of liberalism in that book. And he sort of says you can look at the modern world through the lens of what do you think of the Catholic Church, and then sort of deduce from there what their political positions are going to be. But at the end of the day, I thought that he was far more positive towards political liberalism than comes across in this collection of essays. So maybe you could talk, has his thought evolved over the decades? You said that he's gone from a more sort of latent, invisible Catholic to now a much more explicit Catholic. So maybe that's part of it.
Larry, you're on a roll. Hell, you might even be on fire. I don't know. You're exactly right about intellectual history of liberalism and the vibe or the impression it gives. And then you say what gives today. I'm going to say two, maybe three things. And the first one I just have to say, Manent is French. He talks about Europe. Please do not drag him into our American-focused debates over liberalism, post-liberalism, integralism. Just don't do that. Now, I think that he has many lessons for us here today, but the primary interest in Pierre Manent is not, do I enlist him on my side, either for Communio or the neoconservatives, or so that's the very first thing I just got to say. Go ahead. You look like you want to say
No, no,
something.
I'm realizing. Oh, I've been mispronouncing his name as Pierre Manent. I've been doing that for 30 years, and it's see my I know German so much better than I know French. I only got through my PhD because I was able to translate some passages of Paul Tillich in French. I tested through the French.
Sure.
Paul Tillich had been something was in French by him, and I was able to cobble together enough cognates. There's a lot of cognates in English to French, right? And to figure out, well, this is what Paul Tillich is talking about. And I was able to pass the French test. But my French pronunciations have never been very good. So Pierre Manent, very good, not Manent. That's the first thing. But anyway, go ahead.
Can I tell you, the very first time I met him, for about a decade, he used to come to Boston College to give a mini course. He liked Boston College very much, but he had 4 daughters and he needed to get the money. So the first time I met him, he's a very gracious man. And I said, I'm going to butcher your name. And then I said it, and he said, à peu près, that's close. And he said, I don't care how you Americans say my name. And he gave us permission not to butcher his name, but make a good faith effort. He's not one of those Parisian guys who says, meh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
so
crazy Americans, you cannot say Manant. I will not.
and therefore you have nothing
Yeah,
to say to me. He gives us permission, again, not to butcher, but to do our best and then move on. Okay,
go ahead.
Very quickly, there are 3 stages to his thought. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I do want to place the difference that you articulated. From 72 till 94, i.e. just after the collapse of communism. So from 72 to 94, he was very interested in the health of liberal democracies vis-a-vis the communist challenge. And because that was the biggest political issue of the day.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. He by the way, he's got a keen sense of the obvious. He's super smart. He's read a lot, but he has a keen sense of seeing the world as everybody could see it if you just stop and take your blinders off or your ideological lenses off. So he was part of a 1970s, 80s revival of interest in liberalism in France. And this spanned center-right people, center-left people like Claude Lefort, a very famous phenomenologist, political philosopher. But so I'd say a group of maybe 10 or 12, they did the liberal tradition both in France, because France had a liberal tradition, and in England and America in the West more generally. And so intellectual history of liberalism is one of his 3 contributions to that retrieval project. And he went at it motivated by the Cold War, but animated by a cine era at studio. He wanted to understand. And that's a note that we have a hard time striking in our debates today, or anybody does at any time, right, frankly. So intellectual history of liberalism, he said, look, the church, both when it was hegemonic and then after the Reformation, posed an enormous problem to politics in Europe. Liberalism was one of the options on offer, and it's the one that won. And he says it wasn't because it won, it didn't necessarily mean that a cabal deceived everybody. It seemed to meet the need.
What would can I interrupt for 1 second? Because I get this from my viewers all the time. What would you say in that book, in this sort of first phase of his thinking? How is he defining liberalism?
Okay, he does not have a univocal definition. I think that's, and I've been listening to you, and you go into a mode where you say, "Oh, it's so complex," or now you'd say "so compliqué," But look. Primarily, what he means by it is man is the individual with rights. Government needs to be protective of rights, and self-government means representative government. So it's a combination of Locke and Montesquieu. It's the American founding and framing. So generally.
Yeah.
However, after the French Revolution, a lot of continental liberals were stunned at what had been done in their name. And so this is the second half of an intellectual history of liberalism. He said this was the shock that moved a lot of liberals to reflect on their principles that had been either applied or co-opted, or something had gone wrong with the terror. And then here comes Bonaparte, and then here comes, okay. And so that second half of liberalism, its chief figure is Tocqueville, of holy memory. I hope that's not blasphemous in this season, but anybody who loves human liberty in modern circumstances has to love Tocqueville. But so Tocqueville just represented this very reflective love of human liberty and the modern liberties, but saw dangers in the original liberal project and modern democracy. And so he was a triste liberal, a sad liberal, a chastened one, and more honest about the minuses as well as the pluses of establishing equality and giving people much more liberty than history had wanted to give them.
So there were some definite gains that liberalism brought, and that has to be brought to the surface, right? It's not just simply to be rejected tout court by the Catholic Church or Catholic thinkers.
The first part, I certainly agree with gains, and frankly, social mobility. Now, Pat Deneen is going to say that meant to the dissolution of local communities. That's an old Christopher Lasch theme. So, it's always both and an advance, a general advance of liberalism is going to have downsides. Now, we're okay. So, but economically, we were much more productive. We could feed more people. We had more entrepreneurial energies. We had more talents who could thrive under a free market in liberalism than before that. And I don't want to go back to serfdom or to guilds.
Yeah. Anyway, we could talk for hours about that. Things like maybe Catholic nations would have come up on all of these advances on their own without political liberalism becoming ascendant. The seeds of it were there. After all, isn't liberalism a kind of corrupted Christianity? We'll get to that in a second. But we could talk about that. But let's keep on with the trajectory of Pierre Manent's thought and go on. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, keep me on track. Okay.
Okay.
I'm not given to TMI, but when it comes to Manent, I need somebody saying stop or cut. Okay. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe entered into a new phase of its political and intellectual history. The burning topics were the democratization of the former Warsaw Pact countries, the continued unification of Western Europe that had been started by the Christian Democrats, and then the overarching issue, which is, what is Europe? That is, on what basis should we reunify? Now, Brague is going to come in there, as is Manent, but Brague, he introduced himself to the wider public in '92 with his book on Europe, the Roman Way. And so that was his intervention, his contribution to the great post-collapse of communist debate in Europe. But also Ratzinger joined in with it. Pierre did. And I just want to say, I think that was one of the finest hours for European Catholic intellectual life, the immediate aftermath of the collapse of communism. I'm thinking primarily of French Catholics, but not uniquely. They brought all of their learning and their wisdom and their savvy to bear on the debate of the moment. What's Europe? What's democracy? And then what kind of unity can we have? Okay, I'm going to fast forward super quick.
Go ahead.
According to Pierre, Europe took a disastrous wrong turn in answering all of those questions.
Okay. Yes.
It opted for a secular, or to use Brague's term, exclusively humanistic moral code. So it jettisoned all of Christianity in its self-definition, much less in its public life. And you're old enough to remember the great debate over the proposed European Constitution that
Yes.
JP2, and also Ratzinger, but JP2 said, hey, you can't leave out Christianity's contribution to the roots and the substance of Europe, and yet you're ignoring us in your preamble. So that was in 2005, and that was, major debate in Europe. So Pierre thinks that Europe, official Europe, elite Europe, has taken a huge wrong turn. He first saw it happening in 92, 93 with the Maastricht Treaty, where the proposed constitution then was vetoed by two of the founding members of the European Union, but the elite said, go back and vote till you get it right.
I remember that. It was like 3 votes, right?
Yeah. And same thing happened with the Lisbon Treaty in 2005. But he was early, because he's perceptive. He early on just saw, really, what I'm sketching is elites versus populaces, the division, the fissures, the tension, that we're experiencing here in America and have at least since Trump. He saw that back in 92, 93 in Europe. And when somebody sees something first or early, I pay attention to him and I say, how did you see that so clearly? Okay. Now we are getting to the religion of humanity. What was the wrong term? Well, it was a secular Europe and not a real substantial, Western Civ Europe. But it also was a desiccated view of democracy where it elevated the individual over the national community. And it linked with the individual this vague view of humanity or humanitarianism. So in the aftermath of the collapse of communism, he saw a false view of democracy, which said man is fundamentally an individual, not a citizen, not a member of a self-governing community, in this context, the nation state, and then complemented, but also dwarfed by this vague notion of humanity, which frankly is going to lead to open borders. It's going to be galvanized by Angela Merkel, who had her Protestant German bad conscience, and she didn't want exclusion at all. So she opened the floodgates for Europe back in her long tenure. And we're currently, I'm assuming your readership knows a lot about the state of immigration and the really bad things that are going on in Europe these days as a result of immigration. That doesn't mean I'm a xenophobe or anything like that. These are well-known social facts, whether it be Sweden or Lampedusa, which Pope Francis likes to visit, or Trumpet, et cetera, et cetera.
And Pope Francis seems to be, to maybe take a little sidetrack here before we carry on with Manent, because I think Manent's been a little critical of Pope Francis on this regard as well. He seems to be an advocate of this kind of globalist open border sort of thing. Now let's to steelman the argument just a bit, and Manent mentions this. You can look especially at the history of the 20th century, and it is littered with the genocidal wars and catastrophes created by the ascendancy of the nation state and competition between nation states. So one can perhaps at least understand, if not sympathize somewhat, with the idea that nation states are the new particularism that we need to get. In other words, the only particularism that we need to have an allegiance to is in some vague sense of my individualism and my rights and my choosing. But ultimately, this open board, aren't you just then creating a super state in some sense? Instead of eliminating all states, now you're just creating a bigger state?
You're a good devil's advocate. If I didn't know that you were Christian, I'd be worried. Earlier, I used the term equanimity in connection with Pierre. He wanted to understand. Yes, he says that's part of the story of the nation state, two world wars, xenophobia. Although he says one probably needs to make a distinction between the nation as such and various forms of nationalism. So
Yeah.
he wants to make that. I mean, people talk about patriotism, and they ordinarily by patriotism, they don't mean, hatred of us v. them, or if they do, they have particular things in mind. So anyway, so Manent says, yes, part of the story of the nation state is rivalry, is competition, is colonialization. He can go through the list, the litany, as well as anybody. But then he pauses and he says, that's only, quote, half the story. And this is where he brings in his political philosopher hat, not just his historian hat. He's never just a historian, but he says, look, and then he says, human beings need to fulfill their natures because man is the political animal.
Excuse me.
Man's the political animal. He needs a community of belonging that Aristotle was the first to articulate its features, but in the unique path of European history, it wasn't the polis, it wasn't the empire, it was the nation state that gave the zoon politikon his created, but it fulfilled his nature, political home and community. So what he turns around and he says, okay, you EU democratic humanitarians, you want the universal together with 8 billion individuals or particulars, although a number of them want to reduce the 8 billion to 5 billion or 4 billion or whatever. Yeah. Okay. But your universal, it requires a world state. And then he usually will quote Kant, who said that's the graveyard of human diversity. It's the graveyard of human liberty. And then that does lead to the awkwardnesses that popes from John the 23rd through Benedict to Pope Francis, somehow or another in Catholic social thought, official Catholic social thought, is a call for a universal instance, as I like to say, or a governing instance that regulates national sovereignties in the name of the human common good. So Pierre, he casts a quizzical and doubtful look at part of Catholic social thought.
Yeah, I mean, in steelmanning the argument against the nation state, I in no way meant to imply that argument is correct. It's also, I think, interesting to point out, because this is often tossed out there, that, well, look what evils the nation state has created. And yet, how many nation states are there? I mean, in one sense, one could say that the greatest evils perpetrated were done by just a handful of the most powerful nation states, and being powerful, they entered into competition with one another and dragged the whole world into it. But if you look around the world, most nation states are ordered around cultural and linguistic natural affinities, which are altogether natural and good, and the desire to destroy those things, those linguistic and cultural affinities, in the name of anti-xenophobia or globalism, strikes me, and I get this from Manent as well, strikes me as a real blow to human dignity. So that brings me then to the next point, which is, what actually is then, what are the broad contours of this religion of humanity that he's talking about here? And he almost speaks of it, it's like a substitute or a counterfeit Christianity, a simulacrum of Christianity. So go talk a little bit about that.
The initial elements of it I've already introduced, so I can just refer back to them. After the collapse of communism, what won? Well, in shorthand, it was the democracies over against the totalitarian regimes. So that meant, quote, democracy won. Okay, so everything was legitimated, or had to be legitimated, in the name of democracy. And that was the salto mortale. That was the fateful step that the European elites took. They gutted democracy of the kratos of the demos, the authority
Yeah.
and the capacity to rule itself of a particular concrete people, which in the European context is a nation. Okay, so what they substitute for that? Individual rights. And so all the international in Europe instances, starting with their version of the Supreme Court, which did the same thing that our Supreme Court did under Brennan and in the 50s, 60s, and
Yeah.
70s. Just they so individual rights, and that meant in principle all governments had to provide for the rights not just of their citizens but of any human being who got into their borders. And so already citizenship is being emptied of its meaning, its status, stuff like that. But also because this is going to be a real quick detour, but
No, go ahead.
Go back to Locke. You read your second treatise, probably read a lot more than that, A Reasonable Christianity. If you look at Locke's view of the human, he uses the word species, the human species, the only two natural elements of humanity are the individual and the species. And every other community between the individual and humanity is contractual. Now, that's in principle, you've got an awful lot of superstition and prejudice from the past, whether it be families or whatnot. But for Lockean liberalism, the only natural components are the individual and humanity. Well, the contemporary European Union is the instantiation of that view. Every mediating or intermediate association between the free, rights-filled, gets to choose his associations, and humanity as a whole, every institution is conventional, it's artificial, it's up for negotiation, and that'll lead to, homosexual marriage, quote, marriage. Yeah. And frankly, it just leads to the dissolution of admittedly historically constructed, but now part of the natural warp and woof of human beings' lives. And chiefly that'll be the nation state, but other, inherited communities have the same fate awaiting them.
Yeah.
So what is it? It's Lockean liberalism made the ruling doxa, the ruling indoxa opinion, and then ruthlessly being applied to all extant communities.
Oh, and given Locke's manifest sort of metaphysical deficiencies as a philosopher, it strikes me that there is an inevitable drift, and this is pointed out by the late great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce. There is an inevitable drift in the direction of scientism and the technological paradigm. And so, and that was a big thing of Del Noce, the coming together of these Enlightenment ideals with the scientific revolution. And given the absolute thinness of the metaphysical foundations to any of this, and in fact, maybe even the ignoring of metaphysics entirely as a kind of hegemonic meta narrative that we don't want to dive into, leads inevitably, that creates this vacuum. So I would wonder, to what extent, and I talked about this with Dan Mahoney, to what extent are we dealing with here in this religion of humanity at the same time a kind of almost inevitable steamroller of the technological imperative sort of rolling through society? So everything now gets reduced to a kind of scientific calculus of some kind.
Two things. I personally am very wary of history as unfoldings or inevitable outcomes, because I don't think that Heidegger had his, other people have theirs. So I still want to leave room for our choice, our resistance, our doing stuff.
Right.
And then also, I think if you look at history, honestly, if you look at history, we tend to look at from the point of view of retrospective inevitability. Raymond Aron used that phrase from Berg's Home. I think we need to look at history from the point of view of the protagonists or the agents. How do they articulate their challenges? How do they address them? And then naturally, there's going to be outcomes they didn't foresee. So it's not just agent or protagonist intentionality to understand history. So that's the first thing I want to register. On the other hand, I do think I'll say Manent, he's fully aware of what we could call the Cartesian dimension of modernity, fully, scientism, technology. He's a political philosopher, so he makes that subordinate to and an ingredient in a more broader modern project. And he focuses much more on the political aspects than the scientific aspect. So I want to move back to the political.
Sure, go ahead.
Just to report on, but he look what Descartes helps us understand transgenderism perfectly well. You know that. I mean, everybody knows that now. I mean, it's why people need to read Descartes today. The res cogitans, the res extensa. Help, I'm trapped. But Manent will turn, say, to Hobbes and Locke and say, Hobbes's individualism is, again, a body whose only meaning is to stay preserved and to stay functional as long as possible. And then the purpose of the soul, and he uses that term, but with scare quotes, the purpose of the soul is to maintain that functioning body as long as they can. So you can apply that to a lot of stuff going on today. But with respect to the religion of humanity, for Pierre, it is the apotheosis of the human. So you might liken that to Del Noce or other people. It's the apotheosis of the human, but its two poles really are the individual and then humanity as such or as a mass. And then there's this great scaffolding. There's a fleshing out of that anthropological framework. It looks at history, it looks at nature, it looks at purported divine, and then it tailors history, it tailors nature, both non-human and human, and it tailors any purported divine to that. So it is all encompassing, as I think you indicated. But he would never, I mean, I think today we are in the midst of something of a referendum on modernity. I really do. But his analysis is more political, more depending on our circumstances, choices that are made. So
what does he see the end game being? Where does he see this headed? Not that, once again, I agree with you, there's no inevitability to it, but one can still look at trends and say, well, if the trends continue unabated, here's what's going to happen to us, and here's what might be the result.
Mm-hmm. Well, he much like Solzhenitsyn, he disclaims being a prophet. As a political philosopher, what he does, he tries to articulate many things. He tries to articulate the worldview of the hegemon or the elites. And so that's what we're talking about right now.
Right.
But as well as anybody, he noticed there's tons of popular discontent and increasing resistance to the elites in Europe and here in America. He's going to observe, he's going to critique the elites, and he's going to say, look, man is two things. He's a political animal, and he has some relationship to the Christian imago Dei. And so he just shows that the religion of humanity is an ersatz aping that undermines the two things that we really are, transcendent believers and then deeply engaged agents and members of authoritative communities. And so he just guides all of us in those two vocations and how in European history they interacted, collaborated, were conflictual. Welcome to our world.
And in that vein, before we move on to Remi Brague, what goes back to something you said at the very beginning. He looks at he looks out at the world. He's just being a realist, and he says, okay, you've got these various entities, these blocks, and one of them is the Catholic Church. And he does envision that the church, at least in theory, could play a kind of intermediary role. He certainly would not be an advocate for any kind of a return to confessional states and integralism and all that kind of thing. But what is his view? What is the role in his view, in an ideal sense, of the Catholic Church in this current contemporary situation?
A dear friend of his, Alain Besançon, who coined that phrase, the falsification.
Falsification of the good.
Yeah, but Larry, it's been wonderful seeing you get on board the French train.
Oh, I know. Well, it's this part of me, it goes all the way back to my love of Peggy and Claudel and Francois Mauriac and Gabriel Marcel, Jacques Maritain. I've long admired French thinkers more than German thinkers, actually. Henri de Lubac, Jean Danielou. These are my heroes. Occasionally, a Deutscher will emerge, like a Ratzinger or a Swiss guy like Balthasar, but by and large, my soul leans French. Yes. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
With that list of names, and I would say amen to all that. But that we date ourselves with those kinds of references.
We sure do. We sure do. I mean, those guys are all from like the mid 20th century, but that's how I grew up reading.
Yeah, we're ancient history. So what was your question again? Because I'm amused at your confession of your French soul.
Oh, we were talking about Alain Besançon.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Here, Alain Besançon, he in year 3 of Pope Francis's pontificate, he said, "Seaton catastrophe."
Oh.
So with all of us as just
catastrophe.
Yeah, has observed in angst and all the negative feelings that a faithful son of the church and the Petrine office would feel. And as you said, since 2020, he's been more publicly critical of Pope Francis in terms of his humanitarian preference for, unlimited migration or immigration, or his either denigrating or his simply ignoring of national sovereignty. And, that was the occasion of when the Pope came to Marseille, he explicitly said, "I'm not going to even address the nations. I'm just here for the migrants." And, that's an absolutely classic humanitarian optic and move. Okay, so like all of us, there will be a day when someone else is seated in the throne of Peter. I will say, Pierre, he's given church members, laity, clerics, episcopacy, just really chiseled reminders of man lives in 2 or 3 great communities: his political community, his ecclesiastical community, and then today we do live in a global world. We really do, and so he just tries to sort out those affiliations, those attachments, and not let one, determine the logic or the conduct of the other. So he's, that's
very good.
Broad statement.
Oh, I could also add Bernanos, Gilson.
Yeah.
The list goes, but it only further dates me to 20s. But there are some modern French thinkers as well. Alain Besançon and a few others. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to tease you. I noticed you didn't say Garrigou-Lagrange.
No, I'm not a Garrigou fan.
Okay.
But anyway,
I was
yeah. But anyway, there are actually some things that Garrigou wrote. I've read Garrigou. He's He's not the devil. my my friend Matthew Minard will be very mad at me for poking fun at Garrigou. Let's move on to Remy Brague. Speaking
Sure.
of another,
Yeah.
and I could throw out Jean-Luc Marion, another modern French thinker that I'm very fond of, even though I don't always agree with his sort of anti-metaphysical stances. But let's move on to Remy Brague,
Sure.
and his take on all of this.
Sure. Uh, the Remy Brague, like Manent, he's a member of the generation of 68. They were 18 to 22 in 1968. But just like here at home, Manent and Brague and Chantal Delsol and some of my other French intellectual friends, they didn't go the way of the left. They stayed either sober central or a little bit center right. But Brague, he, as I said, he entered the public lists in 92 with his book on Europe. And I always link Brague with Ratzinger. And this is going to give me a chance to say a few things to you about some of your conversations with some of your interlocutors. Brague won in 2012, he won the Ratzinger Prize for contributions to Catholic intellectual.
Right.
Yeah. Brague and Ratzinger, when they look at the human world, whether presently or in history, their absolutely fundamental category is culture. Therefore, they're different from Manent, who looks at things as a political philosopher. So in my bringing these people together, I'm bifocal and I'm dialectical. And I don't like people who only do culture. I don't like them. But Ratzinger, Brague, they primarily do culture. And in a quick thing, culture for them is a shared view of God, world, man, held by a community as it goes through time and space. And then one could differentiate Brague's view and Ratzinger's. Ratzinger, his comes from Justin Martyr and others, because it has the Christological foundation of it. Brague doesn't go there with his view of culture, but it is God, world, man. And so Brague, he entered the debate not over what democracy is, although he talked about it, not over what the nation is, but Europe as a culture, and in particular, the foundational contribution that Catholic Christianity made to it. Now, that's very much a theme of Ratzinger too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I'll stop there just to, get your response a little bit.
Well, go ahead. I'd just be curious to know. You mentioned conversations I've had with some previous interlocutors. It's not often I get a guest on the show who's actually a faithful viewer of some of my interviews. So I would be interested. Maybe you're referring to some conversations I've had with regard to Ratzinger in particular. So maybe talk about that, because I would be interested in getting your feedback on that.
Well, how's Ratzinger with respect to liberalism? How come he didn't want concordia between the spiritual and temporal powers? Is he a faithful new theologian? He believed in nature grace, but he didn't let it be instantiated in government. I'm not going to name the guy's name, but the conversation you had. If you don't start,
well, I'll mention it was I think Father Harrison Eyre.
Exactly.
And Father Harrison's a bright guy, and he's doing his dissertation on Ratzinger. And I was at a bit of a disadvantage in that conversation. And Father Harrison's listening. He wouldn't mind this at all. He was commenting on an article by a Jesuit, Vincent Strand.
Two Jesuits, yeah.
Two Jesuits, and I was at a disadvantage because I had not read either the articles that he was talking about. And so I was just sort of sitting there going, well, okay, well, yeah, whatever. But I have since been in conversation with, in fact, I've met in person Father Strand, and he goes, I think Father Harrison got some things wrong here. So this is a very, and I think Father Harrison, he's working on a dissertation. I think he'd be most interested in any critique we could. So he's not a thin-skinned guy at all. And so let's go ahead.
Hey,
and I only bring up Father Harrison's name because if my viewers want to go back and watch my interview again or listen to my podcast with Father Harrison to get the context of what we're talking about here. But anyway, go ahead now. This is interesting.
Yeah. My fundamental point is if you don't bring up culture in a discussion of Ratzinger and, generally speaking, politics, if you don't bring up culture within the first 9 seconds, then you haven't framed the issue right. You're going to be putting things either in the wrong place or the proportions are going to be off. Okay, so that's my fundamental thing. Culture for Ratzinger is God role man of a social group. He discussed this in a number of places, but in his book, Truth and Toleration, he's got about 10 pages on his general concept of culture. So God role man that people adopt and that forms them, that they take with them through history. A particular importance is there's a kind of generic template for man. How does this cultural articulate reason? How does it articulate human freedom or will? How does it endorse or make difficult faith? So all of these elements can be fleshed out. But then in addition to that, he says every culture has some articulation of public and private. That's a human constant. Now, we don't put the same things in the public or in the private, but that distinction is absolutely fundamental to human. And then here's where we're getting it. Every historical culture, except for one, secular culture birthed by Europe, the one we're living in now, every culture has made God central to its public life. Whereas our secular culture has expelled God and made him a matter of private life, or as Václav Havel likes to say, put him into the bathroom.
I didn't know Havel said that. That's great. That's good.
Yeah. So now we're getting towards liberalism. We're getting towards the state, but this is the framework that Ratzinger is always working from. And when you ask him, what does he want the church to do, vis-a-vis government, until unless you see this culture thing, this public-private thing, and I haven't yet added government or the state or the church yet, until you see that, they're just free floating, or you're just putting them together, vis-a-vis the American debates, whatever they are. Okay, so Enlightenment birthed a new type of culture called secular culture. I'm sure you've encountered the term in all sorts of readings, and it precisely is the Western anti-culture to all of culture. Instead of God ruled man, you have man world God, and public and private. What you have is man is elevated to the public sphere, God's put in the private sphere. The demotion of the world means technological science, technological mastery. Man up top means there's nothing to look up to. There's no norms to inherit from the past or receive from Sinai. And so that really is the exclusive humanism of Brague. And I keep both of them together because both of them do focus on culture. And both of them see that Europe has taken a tremendous turn, first with modernity, and then more recently, after the collapse of communism, with the European Union. And both of them have just tracked that distillation, that hegemonicization of modernity in the post-Cold War Europe. Now, that's not the same thing as, they're against modernity or even against liberalism. I'll stop there and let you jump in.
Well, just that it's one of the reasons why I love Ratzinger and Balthasar and all of these thinkers is that what you just described is pretty much my view as well. that I'm not much actually of a political thinker, and my viewers, and I mean, I don't get down into the nuts and bolts of political theory very much at all, and quite frankly, for the most part, politics bores me. Politics in that narrower sense, all right, not the broader Aristotelian sense of the polis. Uh, so culture interests me more. So count me among
Sure.
their number. And as you were speaking, I was wondering, and I don't mean to throw you a curveball here, and you're free to sort of just punt. I was thinking of Christopher Dawson and
Mhm.
his thoughts on this as well. That at the heart of every culture is cult, and
Sure.
that as soon as a culture loses its cult, you've lost the culture. So what would Dawson say in all of this as well? This is why I have an affinity with all of this.
Sure. Yeah. I would add Dawson to my early authors that I read. I'm a Catholic convert, in the early 70s. So, you have that list of authors you read in those early, Chesterton, Belloc, Cooper, Carl Adam, but Dawson is part of that group. But also my godfather,
Blondel.
well, I didn't know French yet, so I have to say that. So I was more, English translation stuff. But look, Pieper, Leisure of Basic Culture, he makes the
Yeah.
exact point about culture and cult, and followed it
Yeah.
up with In Tune with the World. So, um, but you had a conversation recently with a dear friend of mine and one of my first students, Mike Heinz.
Oh, yes, Monsignor Heinz at Mount St. Mary's.
Yeah, Mike and I go back to the mid '80s. He was in the first cohort of full-time students I had at St. John Seminary College in Brighton. So we're really, really close. But in your conversation, I noticed you guys ended up talking about Shoshana Zuboff, and then he brought in Ron Dreher. So I was pleased you're aware of the world a little.
I am. I thought
But that was
Shoshana Zuboff's book was great.
well, yeah, because surveillance capitalism means making your life easier and more convenient means that they've got their tentacles in you and they're packaging you. And then Rod Dreher, his book, Live Not My Lies, introduced the phrase soft totalitarianism. The point I wanted to make is you're aware of kind of some of the architecture, some of the components of the political world in which we live, including technology, but stuff like that. So when I listen to you talk with Hanby or Schindler, you got all this grand metaphysical stuff, but I'm always telling my metaphysical friends and my moral theologians, your disciplines are supposed to help us live in the world as it actually is. And until you do political philosophy, I just don't, and broadly speaking, that's, the order of power or the set of goods that are being publicly honored. Until you do that, I just don't see how much help you give believers trying to live in this world. So that
It's interesting. What do you think of D.C. Schindler's book, The Politics of the Real?
I just told you what I thought.
That's great. I love your brutal honesty. This is a great conversation. I love this because it's something that I get all the time too. I'm George Weigel is a good friend of mine, and he's always poking fun at us communio theologian types for living in our metaphysical fog, as he calls it. You live in your metaphysical fog. But you would not deny, would you, Paul, that metaphysics has a very, very important role to play here, right? Obviously, you're a fan of Remi, Brague, and Ratzinger, these guys.
Yeah. Again, two things real quick. Of course not. Uh, we didn't say it, but I actually teach at a Roman Catholic seminary, or we did Roman Catholic seminary, and I
Yeah.
taught the whole range of the courses. And frankly, you don't remember, but I wanted you to come and speak to my metaphysics class because back then I used your and Michael Hanby's, no God, no science, and covenant and creation. I used your books
Oh,
in
that's great.
that class. So
And
don't get me
one
wrong.
did I not go because of my health issue? Was that the reason?
I somehow or another, I connected with maybe your dad, who was more connected with Nebraska, I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've had two issues where I've had to sometimes cancel trips. One is I have an inner ear condition. I have a
Oh,
thing called an acoustic neuroma, which is a benign tumor in my right ear that oftentimes gives me vertigo and balance issues. And like when that happens, I can't go anywhere. But then my father, who's 90 years old, has been. It's one of these deals where okay, this is it, and then you go out there and it's like,
yeah.
well, and he's like the Energizer Bunny. I mean, the man lives on Snickers bars and gravy, and at 90 years old and just keeps going somehow. I don't know. So there's hope
Oh,
out there for all of us. But
yeah, be
anyway,
grateful for that.
I would
So,
love to
no,
come
I'm not
in the future. I
against.
would love. Go ahead.
No, I'm not against metaphysics at all. I think it's absolutely essential for Catholic theology and just to have a Catholic intellect, frankly. So, yeah, I'm teaching.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
I mean,
by the way, I did
go ahead.
review. I did review the Schindler Jr. book, and my title was something like "Metaphysics as Politics?" question mark.
But I think the interesting thing, of course, in that book
Mhm.
is that if you read it very carefully, I think I'm sure you did. There are downstream real world consequences
Sure.
if one were to adopt David Schindler's philosophical political views on the metaphysical underpinnings of things. Um, and so I guess one of my tail end questions for you here would be okay, let's get a bit practical here. Let's
Mhm.
I'm going to be interviewing our mutual friend Ken Craycraft on Thursday about his recent book,
Mhm.
Citizens Yet Strangers, and he's focused on the American political situation and the role of the Catholic Church in that. So where does this all leave us? I mean, what do we do in the light of this as Americans in the current American political situation?
I think all of us, this is me, but I think it's channeling a little bit Pierre's own attitude towards Europe, is each one of us needs to live out our vocation as fully and these days as courageously as we can. So if I'm a teacher, I need to, enlighten minds. You had one vocation, now you've got a more complex
A little
next.
more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
complex. You're the busy bee of uh, your cohort. So the fundamental line is it's not ignore the macro, because I've just said you can't live thoughtfully and faithfully if you are unaware of the gathering tyrannical storms, the clouds and storms. COVID just was a beginning of that. So first thing you got to do your vocation. The second thing I really am a big believer is isolation is the stuff of tyranny. So we've just got to connect. We've got to network. We've got to uh, get to know who sees one way or another what we see and is willing to take action. So
Sounds,
I
yeah.
have a little fantasy. I really think somebody, not you, and I don't have the technical, somebody should just kind of do a public list of these people are good on COVID, these people are good on this or that, and just make that kind of information available.
Yeah. I think that would be a tremendous because right now, well, I could go down the whole COVID rabbit hole and
Yeah.
discussing about but it's an interesting conversation to have because there's an interesting political and sociological lesson to be learned and everything that's gone down with regard to the whole COVID pandemic, regardless of what you think. I mean, information is basically broken down into acceptable information that we will disseminate to you as per governmental approval. And then everything else is just disinformation. It could come from a Stanford scientist, a Harvard scientist, but if it doesn't abide by the party line, it's disinformation. And this is kind of Shoshana Zuboff's point too in surveillance capitalism. Is it's not just they're watching us, they're manipulating us.
Mhm.
And this to me is interesting in and of itself, kind of scary too in very fundamental ways. So I'm with Peter Morin, cult culture and cultivation. You know
Okay,
that the,
sure.
and then there's a resonance of Christopher Dawson in there as well, the centrality of cult. And I think that the current moment that we are in calls for, I like what you said, for each of us to live our vocations. Because Paul, I get this question all. I go and give talks. I just gave one out in South Dakota. Wonderful people, Mount Marty University, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Beautiful cathedral there. Great people. Shout out to Joe Rutten and friends out there. But in the Q&A after my talk, I got the inevitable question. Well, you didn't tell us what we're supposed to do.
Sure.
Yeah, I talked a lot about, the religion of humanity, the technological paradigm. We're up in it now. We're basically just all, and now we need to double down on sanctity and holiness and our own vocations and all that kind of stuff. But then they still come back and say, yeah, that's all great, but what are we supposed to do? And what do you make when people ask that question? I'm really trying hard to answer that question for people. But I have to admit, I'm not certain I really know what the question is asking for. What does it mean? So when people say, "What are we supposed to do?" What do you think they're asking of us?
I don't travel as much as you, but I receive that question regularly, oftentimes from seminarians, which is kind of my regular audience. And I always say, live your vocation, and then I say, and then it will be shown to you what you should do.
That's
So I
right.
I link it back to God's not abandoning us, and He's not micromanaging us either, but He's not abandoning us. And so I think persistence in prayer, being honest about what you try, and then literally, not just how it worked out, but how you felt about it. And if you get a lot of negative feelings about a vocation, a possible vocation, it's probably not for you. So,
Yeah, I think too, there's an element of the story of the rich young man here in the Gospels, in the sense that when I answer the question, and we should wrap this up soon, but this is really fascinating to me, Paul, because you're in seminary formation. And on tomorrow, I'm talking with Father John Kelly, who's the rector at St. John Vianney Seminary out in Minnesota. I spoke with Father Andy Baker of Mount St. Mary's. I spoke with a few, Father Keith Chilinsky, now Bishop Chilinsky at St. Charles Seminary. So this is interesting to me in terms of seminary formation as well, which is that you say to them, live out your vocation. Whatever your vocation is, live it out good. And as I said in South Dakota, well, as Peter Morin and Dorothy Day said, do the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, double down. And yet it's almost as if they then come to you and say, but master, I'm not master, but I'm
yeah.
parroting the story. I've done all these things since my youth. What do I need to do to be perfect? So I think there's actually something really good percolating in the church right now. Now, of course, the rich young man eventually walked away because Jesus says, okay, do this.
Yeah.
I think what the question means, yeah, corporal spiritual works of mercy. Yeah, my vocation. But what are we supposed to do? I think they're asking, how do I live a more radical life?
Mhm.
How can I live a more radical existence as a Catholic in the culture of today? What do I need to do to be more perfected than
Mhm.
what's going on? I think. Do you think there's a dynamic of that especially in some of your seminarians, or not?
They're a little younger to,
Yeah.
to, I really think that, I mean, young men, they come to the seminary and thinking I'm a study for the priesthood. And the first thing they discover is how difficult it is to be a Christian. That's First awakening in
Having
seminary.
been a seminarian, I'm laughing hysterically because some things never change, I guess, you know.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
that's the scale that falls.
Absolutely.
So um, I, 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 I had two thoughts. One of them is, what are we supposed to do? You say radical Christianity. That's you. That all of us need to be deeper in our faith, more ardent in our practice. We all do. I don't. What are we to do? That's been the question that Pierre Manent has been addressing the past 15 years. Que faire? What is to be done? And not in the Lenin sense.
Yeah.
And he's constantly reminding us that we're political animals as well as imago Deis. And so I tend to take the political philosopher tack or contribution is what we are to do. You need to be informed. You need to join, local associations. I think networking is really important. So I think those complement each other. And frankly, yeah, I think you need both, given our circumstances today, with a very challenged church and an awful lot of gathering tyrannical clouds over America and the West.
Yeah. I think the networking thing is important, as I often say to people, but we can't do this alone.
No,
We
no.
need to network with
Mhm.
what's really important is for us to develop community and a community of Christian friends, and not necessarily just Christian friends, just a community. Even you make the ripple effect of your concentric circles, the pebble into the pond, as the ripples go out. Don't be afraid of reaching out beyond the Christian circles to like-minded people, even if they're not, overt Catholics or whatever. I think that's very important.
Oh, it needs to be underscored and, and again, I think it kind of cuts across a lot of older, or maybe even current divisions when
Yeah.
again, if you start to see the situation roughly similarly, it's much less important that you're a Muslim or a Orthodox Jew or a liberal Jew or.
And I think it's very important at our day and age to sort of point these things out, because we're really kind of up in it, as I like to say. We're up in it now. Or as my dad, who fought in the Korean War, likes to say, we're in deep kimchi,
Yeah, yeah.
and he hated kimchi. So
So I was stationed in Korea in the army, and I tried to taste it once, and it almost killed me. And I, I then became an ugly American because I just could not eat it.
see, I don't know what kimchi's like in Korea, especially the Korea during the war when my dad was there. But I like kimchi. I go to a Korean restaurant. I really like kimchi. It's like garlic fire, cabbage garlic fire. It's all right.
Less Constitution despite your ear.
Yeah, despite the year. Are there any last words you'd like to impart to the viewers here? We could do a part two. I could talk to you forever, Paul. You know, we could talk about in a future pod. You've written to me before, because I tossed the word bourgeois around rather liberally. Pardon the pun. Rather liberally. And I get that from, Ratzinger uses, was it Tracy Rowland talks about the bourgeois, Christopher Dawson talked about the bourgeois, Berdayev talked about the bourgeois mind, the bourgeois spirit, Dorothy Day talked about the bourgeois spirit. But you've been a little bit critical of my freewheeling use of the word bourgeois, because it does actually then, if you look at the Marxist use of it, right, in 20th century, and you're much more conversant with that than I am. So let's actually end with that. What does that word bourgeois technically mean in that narrower sense that sort of most political philosophers would recognize?
One of the many reasons why I like you is in your various social media, you actually respond to people and you take criticism well. And this was just a somewhat recent experience I had of that. What I brought to your attention, and this connects with what we've been talking about, the most famous French historian in the 20th century, Francois Furet, if you
Pray.
are A former communist who saw the light and then became a great historian of French politics, European politics, ideology. Okay, Francois Ray. Kind of his chef d'oeuvre was called The Passing of an Illusion. And in it, he just pointed out that, surprise, surprise, both communists and National Socialists had a common enemy, which was a combination of social class and ideological fiction, which they named the bourgeois. And I just think that should give someone a little pause if those people chose that as their
Yeah.
enemy. But then
yeah, go ahead.
You nicely responded, I mean it in a specific sense. And so I was happy with, your.
But I liked your caveat because it's what you say is absolutely true, and I knew that too. I'm not an expert in it, but I was aware. Well, the word bourgeois is freighted with some historical meanings here that I don't mean. So at the very least, I should, if I'm going to use the term, I should clarify. Here's what I don't mean, and maybe even come up with a different term to use. I have no ego in these things. I'm an idiot half the time, so
The best thing to be is a lifelong learner.
That's right. I'm a lifelong learner, and life, life's too short to get all proprietary about whether or not you were wrong or right about something. I just like the discourse. I like the ideas, and I like people. One of the things I like about Manent, it's what I like about another French thinker whose writings I have recently discovered, Madeleine Delbrel. I admire thinkers who have a jeweler's eye for nonsense. I admire thinkers who actually care about the real. And so I've drifted more and more lately to another French thinker, Emmanuel Falk, phenomenology, because I think there's great merit, not necessarily all the metaphysical implications of phenomenology, Husserl and people like this, Merleau-Ponty, but just getting how we actually experience reality correct, to do a deep dive into beyond verbiage, what we mean by the words that we use, the descriptors that we use. And I think Pierre Manent especially is very, very good at piercing that.
My dear friend and your now new friend, Dan Mahoney, he loves to quote Solzhenitsyn. Our task today, and it requires courage, is to see.
Yeah. Oh, and that's a great way to end, I think. Our task today is to see and to maybe help others to see.
Yeah.
And then have them help us to see, because none of us sees alone. But
bringing in Balthasar, my vocation is for the transcendental, the truth, but there's also the good and the beautiful.
Absolutely.
I think yours is some combination of the true and the good, but
I think so. The true and the good, and maybe the beautiful, but I don't know. I don't talk about that as much. The older I get, the uglier I get. I stay away from the category of beauty.
Your cute pictures of your goats and your dogs, that brings a lot of natural beauty into the social media.
Absolutely. And you've been a supporter of our farm here and so on. So I thank you for that. And so that's great. Anytime you want to visit the farm, Paul, feel free, pop on in. And maybe someday I'll make it down to one of your classes down there and in Baltimore. I do go to Baltimore once in a while. My friend Abby Steele, she does focused missionary sort of work. Yeah. You know Abby?
I've heard of her recently, and she seems like a very interesting, committed woman. Yeah.
Very much so. And she keeps inviting Carrie, my wife, and I down. We know her well. I gave a talk in Baltimore last year or something. But anyway, and my friend Andrew Lakutis is down there. I'm sure you know Andrew. He's much bigger fan of Pope Francis than I am, but God bless, as they say in the South, God bless his heart. Anyway, enough of this banter. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming on the show. Maybe we'll get Dan Mahoney on here, and the three of us can do can do a podcast. I think that would be great. Maybe I'll give him a, if you'd be open to that, I'll send
Yeah,
Dan a,
you would just join our 40-year conversation.
that's what I was hoping for. That's my best podcast where I just sit back and enjoy the ride as other people are doing the heavy lifting. I thought this was a great conversation, Paul. Thank you for coming here today. And thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you now.
Happy